Welcome back to another video. This one's a little different from all the other ones. Those have been on my series concerning wisdom. This video is the beginning of a new series, which I'm going to title something like Living with Human Nature. I was inspired to start this series based on a sermon I heard in church today, on the very same verses that I'm going to read to you today. So if you're watching this, Alonzo, right on. But what do I mean by human nature? Basically, how best, considering our form, the way, the things that constitute the way that we are, and the nature of human relationships, how best can we live to fulfill those? Well, this video concerns the verses Colossians 3:18 through 4:1, and it's on the family, more specifically the Christian family, but I suppose you could say that this would be an ideal for any family situation. Since these are some really important verses, I want to take this video to just give you a brief overview of everything that I'm going to talk about as in future videos, I'm going to dissect each verse individually and talk about each role that Paul, the author of Colossians, mentions and, gives instruction to in these verses. So, it reads, "Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. Slaves, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. Masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven." So there's a lot of instruction here, and that's for good reason, because these are the most important relationships that a person could have in their lifetime. You have spousal relationships, you have children to parent relationships, parent to children relationships, that's a third one, and also slave to master, which, sounds odd because people don't have slaves nowadays, at least not in America. But the way that we're going to frame that relationship will make how that's helpful evident in a second. So, Paul says, "Wives, submit to your husbands, as is fitting to the Lord." When he says to the Lord, the way I read that is as is fitting to nature, because God is the rules that govern the universe, which is natural. It's nature. So when he says, "Submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord," what he's meaning is that, well, women, by and large, generally speaking, are smaller and weaker than men. Obviously, there are exceptions, but as Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau that is, once said, people who argue from exception are shallow-minded. So we're going to stick to generalities here. But as women are generally smaller and weaker than men, it makes sense that, I guess to take a realist's perspective, the weak bend to the will of the strong, because that's natural. I'll get more into the nature of this submission in future videos, but it's not as master and slave-like as you might be led to believe. He continues, "Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them." Now, there's a lot of misconceptions in the non-Christian world concerning Christian relationships, and maybe even in Christian relationships themselves. What these two verses are not meaning to imply is any measure of inferiority of women or superiority of men, but rather making each fulfill its form best. Men are stronger, and so they have the privilege of leading, And while they lead, they ought to show love to the person that they're leading, aka their wife, and, quote, not to be harsh with them, end quote, because, when you are a leader over someone who's more than likely weaker than you, there is a certain amount of temptation to be a bit of a tyrant, which is what he's arguing against. But we'll talk more about that in a future video. He continues, "Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord." As a child, in your minority, you are subject to the will of your parents. And further than that, you owe them your literal life, because without your parents, your father, who I guess you could say, donated his sperm to create you, and your mother, who donated her egg to create you, came together. You owe your literal existence to them, and since there's really no greater gift than the gift of life, there's no real way to repay them. But the best way to approximate repaying your parents would be to be obedient to them. But more on that later. Fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged. Again, this is along the same vein as being a husband. If you are too tyrannical in your rule making and how some parents like to make a lot of decisions for their children, but Paul is arguing against that here. He's saying, don't do that. Don't be tyrannical as a parent. Let your children have some freedom, because otherwise they will become, quote, discouraged, or, in other words, obstinate. They won't want to obey you because of just the rebellious part of human nature. But there's more on that later. This is just a brief overview. This is where it gets interesting. Slaves, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Well, people don't really have slaves anymore in America, but we can take this another way. Rather than focus on literal slavery, we can focus on relationships between someone who is given authority over you and yourself. So obviously, you have a sort of master and a sort of slave, or underling if you prefer. What Paul is saying here is that if there's someone who has authority over you, respect it. If they give you an order, then it's your place to obey, because they have the authority over you. But he's cautioning you against being people pleasers, meaning just obeying because you want to endear people to you. But he's saying that you should obey people because you have respect for your position in respect to their position. As someone who is positioned lower in authority, say just an entry-level employee, compared to the CEO, who is the highest person in a company, it's your place, it's your job to obey the orders of the people who have been placed above you. And he continues, "Whatever you do, work heartily for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive an inheritance as your reward." I'm going to get into that in a future video. As well as him saying, "You are serving the Lord Christ, for the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality." Again, a future video. At the beginning of chapter 4, he says, "Masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven." Again, this is another caution against tyranny. As a master, who, by right of authority, have the privilege, I suppose you could say, of giving those under you orders, what you should not do is tyrannize them by making them do things that are unjust, or things that are against the law, or that decrease their dignity, or their honor, or their virtue. And beyond that, you should treat them fairly. So if they do a job well done, then they deserve the pay of someone who's done a job well done. But we're going to get into that in a future video. I hope you've enjoyed this video. It's just a brief overview, as I've said, and I'm going to get into all these topics more deeply in the future, but let me know your comments and thoughts on this brief overview so far in the comments below. Make sure you leave a like if you like this video, or a dislike if you didn't, and make sure to like and so used to saying that. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you never miss a new video. Thanks for watching. Colonel's in, Colonel's out.